Well, it's presidential campaign season, which means you're going to hear a lot of statements from candidates about the economy. So how do you sort through the rhetoric to be able to identify which proposals will actually support free enterprise?
Well, I tend to think that somebody who I would trust with that is somebody who has a commitment to balancing budgets and not overspending.
On this episode, we welcome back Beth Akers for another Defending Enterprise segment. And we're going to equip you with a better way to defend free enterprise amidst all the campaign rhetoric you'll hear over the next year. You're listening to Defending Ideas. Defending Ideas is a weekly podcast produced by Sutherland Institute. On this show, we are committed to renewing the principles of common sense conservatism, making you a better champion of sound ideas. Welcome back to another episode of Defending Ideas. I'm your host, Nic Dunn, and it's time for another installment of Defending Enterprise with our contributor, Beth Akers, who's also a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. Beth, welcome back to the show.
I'm glad to be back. Thanks.
So we want to talk about politics a little bit, but we'll try and filter it through the lens of economics and free enterprise. But the presidential election season is in full swing. It's heating up.
We're there already.
We're in it.
Yes.
It seems like it starts earlier and earlier every time. So that means our listeners are going to hear a lot of things said about jobs in the economy from people running for office. So we want to talk through essentially how our listeners can develop a framework if they say, well, I'm somebody who supports free enterprise and I want to show that support with my vote. How do I do that? How can I approach that? So that's what we want to get into today. But to kick things off, I wonder if we can start with what has become one of perhaps the biggest economic issues this year and in recent months, and that's inflation.
Yes.
We all feel it. Things are expensive. The number of times when I've been at the store and seen something that, well, that is doubled in price. So can you first kind of give us a status check? What's the state of inflation today? Are things actually getting any better? Is there any hope on the horizon?
Yeah. So, inflation was low for something like a decade. And so it's an issue that a lot of people just haven't had to think about in a very long time. But it kind of smacked us all in the face when we started going to the grocery store and eggs and milk and everything was more expensive. So this kind of kicked off right after the COVID pandemic economic downturn and kind of hasn't eased up quite yet. So we're definitely doing better than we were previously. We had inflation at higher levels in previous months than it is today. It seems to be looking like it's slowing, and maybe we're being successful with the methods that we're trying to tame it. So we're in decent shape. But the fact that we have had that inflation is definitely putting a damper on the economy.
So I want to pinpoint one thing because I think sometimes it's kind of confusing for all of us when economists or people in the administration say that, well, inflation is lower now than it was in the past. It doesn't mean that prices are dropping. Prices are still increasing, but prices are just increasing at a less intense rate than they were before. Can you help explain that a little bit?
Yeah, exactly. So like the steady state here is actually not that prices are constant. We kind of all know that over time prices are increasing. The stability that we're looking for is not that prices are stable themselves, but that the rate at which prices are increasing is relatively steady. So the thing that we look for in terms of predictability that supports businesses being able to make plans and to be efficient, and households being able to make plans and be efficient, is that the inflation is going to be predictable. And so part of the mission of the Federal Reserve, which has been part of the news cycle very frequently lately, is to stabilize at a particular rate of change. And so that target right now is around 2%. Sort of irrelevant to most people to know that figure, but we want to, emphasize the idea that what we're targeting is to have a constant rate of change that's low.
I want to ask you about kind of what can be done about it, what is being what is being done about it. But you mentioned the Fed. Before we get there, can we first talk about what caused inflation?
Yeah.
Again, we're already hearing now, folks on one side of the aisle say, well, government spending is 100% to blame.
Right.
Folks on the other side of the aisle say, well, there's other factors, or maybe it's corporate greed. Shed some light, help our listeners understand, okay, what's the best clear-headed way to understand what has actually caused the spike in inflation?
Well, I would say anybody who tells you that it's entirely this or entirely that, you can kind of write off their point of view because they're probably wrong about it. It's very likely it's a mix of all of the above, maybe with the exception of corporate greed, because I don't like that explanation, but let me walk through that. So, there's usually a few factors that people are considering. One is that we had a pretty drastic expansion of federal spending at the onset of the COVID pandemic. Part of that was totally justified, and we needed it to make sure that we were able to bring the economy back online quickly and people weren't suffering. But there's also concern that that really is what drove some of the inflation that we've been experiencing that has also been harmful to people. So researchers really disagree about to what extent that government behavior drove the inflation that we're seeing. And it's kind of a case of you can find research to support probably whatever position you want to take. Conservatives are really quick to blame this Democratic administration for the expansive spending, whereas progressives tend to lean on other explanations, like the idea that maybe corporations are greedier today than they were in the past. I find that one to be a hard sell, but there are other more reasonable explanations also that are more endorsed by that side of the political spectrum. Things like the supply chain issues that we talked a lot about in popular media right after the pandemic. The fact that things were shut down and it was hard to get stuff. That does make things more expensive when there are less things here for us all to get. And you and I both want to buy it. We get into a bidding war and that makes the prices go up. So each of these things is probably a factor. One study that I like to cite indicates that about a third of the inflation that we saw between late 2019 and mid-2022 was driven by the spending that we saw in the aftermath of COVID. But after that, the estimates are pretty imprecise, and it's probably best to think of it as kind of a mix of all of those factors.
I want to ask you about that 1/3 number, because I think a lot of the discussion around, well, how much has our deficit spending as a country contributed to inflation is really focused on the last few years and the pandemic response. But what about the years or decades of spending beyond our means prior to that? Is there anything that tries to account for how much has that year-over-year deficit spending sort of contributed to this ticking time bomb, and then did the COVID spending blowout just finally set it off? How do you account for that history of spending?
Yeah, this is the kind of research that's really difficult to pinpoint and answer really precisely. But I think it's definitely the case that, there are two factors. One is the Fed kept interest rates really low, which you kind of think of as kind of like the gas pedal on the economy. When interest rates are low, we're kind of gassing it up, keeping things going. We kept it low for a long time, or I should say the Federal Reserve kept it low for a long time. And at the same time, we were pumping a lot of money into the economy through fiscal policy. That is tax cuts, getting money out to the hands of people through different programs. And both of those things were really revving the engine of the economy. And maybe putting us closer to that tipping point that pushed us into this period of inflation that we're now having to fight against.
So to kind of bookend this question of, okay, what has caused it? What is causing it? Is it fair to say that, look, it's a little bit of everything?
Yeah.
We all have some responsibility. We all, meaning government policy, supply chains, some of these other things. So it's kind of more of a collectivist, hey, there's a lot of factors that go into this. Let's have a clear-eyed look at all of them. But then, yes, still have the discussion about what are solutions we can apply to each of those different causal factors to inflation?
I think that's exactly right. And I think we can definitely point to each of those causes as playing a role here. But probably the more important conversation to be having now is, what are the things that we can do about it going forward?
So I want to ask you about what can be done about it, because I think it's easy for folks out there to say, well, my grocery bill keeps going up. When I'm paying for energy for my home or gas for my car, I'm feeling it in the wallet. So isn't there something that can be done? What has been done so far, and is anything working?
Yeah. So if you step kind of way back from more of like a theoretical textbook perspective on this, there are two main categories of things that we can do. One is fiscal policy. The other is monetary policy. Let's start with fiscal. Essentially means what the government is spending. government spending matters for inflation, because when we're pumping money into the economy, that is, the government is spending, the government is giving cash to people through tax cuts, through stipends, whatever it may be, we're again putting gas into that engine to get the economy going. When people have more money to spend, they can go out and spend, they drive up demand, and that makes things more expensive. Companies can raise prices when they've got customers out the door. And so pumping money into the economy that way is one way in which we can either accelerate or decelerate the economy. So yes, we have seen that there's less spending today than there was during the period immediately after the onset of COVID, and that is in fact contractionary in a way. We may need to see more of that. So the other hand is the non-political avenue. So obviously that one's fraught with the fact that, we're fighting all the time about what we should be spending coming out of the federal government. The apolitical piece of this is monetary policy, and that's the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve is an institution that stands separate from the political machine in Washington. It's a bunch of really smart economists looking at and studying, measuring what's happening in the economy. And they've got control of the gas pedal, which is the interest rate at which banks lend to one another. Sounds kind of down and into the weeds there, but what that means is that's basically determines the cost of capital for the economy. The cost of cash, how easily can you borrow to buy things? When we make it expensive to get your hands on cash, people stop buying things. Most people are probably familiar with the dynamic in the housing market right now, which is that interest rates are really high and people don't want to buy houses. That's a pretty practical example of how monetary policy can kind of work through the economy to kind of pump the brakes. And so that's what we're seeing. Basically, the fiscal policy and monetary policy both have the capacity to accelerate or tap the brakes for the economy. And in order to get that inflation to slow, they both need to be working together, tapping those brakes.
We need to take a quick break, but when we come back, I want to share a couple of quotes from our leadership in this country that's trying to do those two things and kind of get your reaction on them about, can we just reduce spending? Is that a good way to sort of measure how effective we're being at trying to address inflation? And then some of the kind of more wonky things you talked about with playing around with the interest rates that the Fed can do. So I want to get into that when we come back and then talk more about, is anything working with kind of bringing down inflation? And then also get into some other economic issues that people are going to hear about in the next year for the presidential election cycle, and equip folks with sort of a principled free enterprise framework that they can use to measure against things being said. So when we come right back, we'll dive into that. This is Defending Ideas. Stick around.
Sutherland Institute is an independent, nonprofit public policy think tank based in Salt Lake City, Utah. Our mission is to defend the principles of the American founding and strengthen the institutions of civil society essential for those principles to endure. Sutherland provides research, events, and multimedia to policymakers and the public to promote the principles of faith, family, freedom, opportunity, and responsibility. Visit sutherlandinstitute.org.
Welcome back to Defending Ideas. We're going to continue our conversation with AEI Senior Fellow Beth Akers, who is also our Defending Enterprise contributor. But first, I want to mention, if you like what you're hearing, please visit us at defendingideas.org. You can find clips from this episode and previous shows that you can use on social media and in your conversations with family and friends. You can also subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google, essentially wherever you like to get your shows. That's defendingideas.org. Beth, as we're talking about inflation, I think it's always helpful to hear what our leaders are saying about it. And so there's a quote from President Biden where he's talking about what they've been doing. Let's listen to that, and then I want to gauge your reaction to it.
Today, my administration announced that this year, the deficits fell by $1.4 trillion. The largest one-year drop in American history, $1.4 trillion decline in the deficit. Let me repeat that. The largest ever decline of the federal deficit.
So Beth, when the president says, hey, the deficit dropped by $1.4 trillion because we spent so much money responding to COVID, isn't that kind of like if I go to my wife and say, hey, I know last year I took out a loan for a luxury cabin that we didn't have the money for. This year, I only took out a loan for a luxury boat. Aren't I doing great with reducing our household spending?
Yeah, I think that's a very accurate way of characterizing this. And, this is something that all administrations, Democratic, Republican, engage in. And it's sort of taking advantage of the fact that people maybe don't really understand the dynamics of how deficits work or where we are in the cycle of recovery from COVID. We spent a tremendous amount of money to basically prevent an economic downturn right on the heels of the COVID pandemic, and sort of successful in doing that. But again, we spent a tremendous amount of money to do that. And so the idea that we're spending less now than we were then, that's kind of a no-brainer. Of course we are, right? We spend a lot in moments of crisis and less now. So to celebrate that as a big win is kind of misleading, but it's something that I think most voters probably don't have the luxury of thinking about these things in as much detail as we do today. So hopefully we can empower them to think about it a little bit differently with this conversation.
And is it kind of acknowledging that, as you've alluded to, some of that spending, I don't know what the right dollar amount would be, you might be able to weigh in on that, but some of that spending was necessary and helpful to avert a catastrophe, but maybe we just went too far.
Well, it's not clear. So when we were going into the COVID pandemic, I mean, the biggest word you're seeing in media coverage was unprecedented. I remember seeing that in almost every headline because we just didn't know what was coming. And, the intervention that we put in place to try to prevent a real serious economic crisis was also unprecedented. So I'm not going to point a lot of blame and say there was overspending in this space that was kind of, we knew to be overspending at the time because no one really had a sense of what was going to happen. But in retrospect, it does seem like a lot of that spending did contribute to where we are today, which is facing some really negative consequences because of the stimulus effect of that spending.
So kind of there's this principle of balance is spending to some degree to help sort of soften the blow of a potential recession is warranted, but maybe it went too far. There's a balance question. Could you also say the same thing about sort of playing with the interest rates that the Fed does, that there is a balance question there, which is something we'll hear about from Fed Chairman Jerome Powell, that are we sort of getting that balance right with tightening those interest rates? So let's listen to a clip from him as well and then get your reaction and maybe just ask you, are we balancing it right? Are we getting to the soft landing that we want? Let's hear from Chairman Powell.
A good part of Wall Street has become more confident that the Fed is going to be able to engineer a soft landing, and they've reduced their forecasts for a recession. And I'm wondering if the staff has changed its view on the likelihood of a recession being likely, and if you personally have changed your view in terms of becoming more confident that you can achieve a soft landing.
So it has been my view consistently that we do have a shot, and my base case is that we will be able to achieve inflation moving back down to our target without the kind of really significant downturn that results in high levels of job losses that we've seen in some past instances, many past instances of tightening that look like ours. That's been my view. That's still my view.
So there, Beth, I mean, the chairman is essentially being asked a question from the room about, hey, are we doing this right? Are you confident? Are we avoiding recession, getting to a soft landing?
Yeah.
What's your take? Is it working?
Well, let's step back first and say, we've been throwing around this word soft landing. I think listeners probably have heard that a lot, but maybe don't know exactly what that means. So in the context of monetary policy, and really with fiscal policy too, these are really blunt instruments. So economists like me like to pretend that we're scientists and, but giving it a dose of fiscal austerity to the economy is not like giving a dose of penicillin. We don't really know exactly what's going to come of any particular dosage that we apply. So in the instances of monetary policy in the past where we have tightened in order to deal with inflation that we're experiencing, the consequence has sometimes been pushing the economy into recession. So putting a lot of people out of jobs. And so sometimes that's seen as an inevitable consequence of using monetary policy to slow down the economy. But a soft landing is the idea of it is kind of what it sounds like, which is, when you land that plane, you definitely want to bring it down softly and not, tank and hit bottom, right? And that means basically, can we slow the economy, but at a rate where we don't need to go below zero? We don't need to push ourselves into a recession. We don't need to kick people out of jobs. We can just slow it very, very gently, like our parents tried to teach us to use the brake pedal when we were learning to drive, right? Instead of slamming on the brakes. And so we've actually looked like we're on a track where that's still a possibility. When we started this exercise of trying to slow the economy with interest rates, I think people were pretty skeptical that that was something that could happen. But I'd say that the rate of slowing of inflation that we've seen so far still makes me feel pretty optimistic that there's a possibility. And I think the experts who predict recessions in the marketplace seem to be convinced of that as well, because I think recession expectations have declined as well.
And again, it seems to be coming back to this principle of balance. I think too often in many political discussions we have as a country, but with respect to the economy as well, there seems to be too often this focus on sort of binary things. And so either economic growth is good and economic recession is bad. But this idea of growth or not growth, it's more a question of balance, because inflation is essentially you have sectors of the economy that are growing too fast because prices are spiking up. And so is it, again, with respect to growth and kind of easing off the gas and slowing down a little bit, it's this question of balance. Let's get back to a steady hum of our economic engine. Is that the right way to think about it?
I think that's
voters?
the right way to think about it. And so the non-political arm of this, which is the Federal Reserve doing monetary policy with interest rates, they're pretty good at that. I mean, their entire game is trying to find that balance. I'd say the place where we're weaker on that is on the fiscal policy side. So if we've got these two major tools, right? One is monetary policy and interest rates, and the other is how much we spend in government. We know that the process through which we decide how much to spend is much more dysfunctional than I believe the Federal Reserve's processes are, which I actually have a lot of confidence in as an economist. So I think that's the place to think about as a voter. I mean, people don't always appreciate that the Federal Reserve is really a non-political institution. So voters shouldn't be thinking a ton about that as we go into the next cycle. But what they should be thinking about is whether or not someone they're looking at as a candidate is someone who will employ the sort of strategy that would achieve balance through fiscal policy, be willing to pull back on spending if that's what's necessary to slow the economy, or expand in cases where, that's not. So it's the willingness to utilize that, which is one of the core tools that we have to address inflation.
I think that's a helpful way to sort of give listeners a sense of a guidepost. So when they're looking for candidates, what is something, is there anything specific that they can look for that when a candidate says, well, this is what we ought to do with respect to spending, give kind of just your best, here's your rubric with respect to inflation, and how will they know essentially if a candidate is serious or grounded enough in the economic issues and the understanding of the issues to be able to have an actual appropriate approach to bringing down inflation?
Well, I tend to think that somebody who I would trust with that is somebody who has a commitment to balancing budgets and not overspending. I know that, Democrats in particular seem to have a harder time reining in spending, even when it seems to be the right thing for the economy. So I would probably be looking to candidates who are keen on fiscal responsibility, balancing budgets, and, making sure that we're spending, for the most part, within our means, unless there's a really urgent call like there was during COVID.
We've spent a lot of time on inflation because, again, as we mentioned at the outset, it's one of the most impactful, perhaps the biggest thing on a lot of people's minds these days with respect to the economy. But I want to ask you about other economic issues that often get debated during campaign season that will, of course, be debated this campaign season. We're going to take a quick break and get back into some of those kinds of things when we come back. Again, we're speaking with Beth Akers from the American Enterprise Institute and our Defending Enterprise contributor here at Defending Ideas at the Sutherland Institute. Stick around. We'll be right back.
For a deeper dive into the issues you care about, read Sutherland Institute's official blog, Insights and Takeaways. You'll gain deep insights from policy experts and relevant takeaways voters need to know. Visit sutherlandinstitute.org.
Welcome back to Defending Ideas. I'm Nic Dunn, and we've been talking with Beth Akers, Senior Fellow at the American Enterprise Institute and contributor for Defending Enterprise segments here on Defending Ideas. And we want to continue the conversation and give you some insights into what to look for in the coming year, what kinds of statements will you be hearing about from different candidates, and how to weigh those statements against a truly principled and pragmatic approach to defending our free enterprise system in this country. Before we jump back in, though, I want to mention, if you like what you're hearing today, please visit us at defendingideas.org. You can subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google, YouTube, essentially any of the major platforms wherever you like to get your shows. You can also find short clips from this episode and previous episodes that can help you articulate these ideas in your conversations with friends and family. That's defendingideas.org. So, Beth, we talked a lot about inflation. There are, of course, going to be other economic issues that come up over the next year or so with this presidential campaign season in full swing. So I want to ask you, one, hopefully inflation won't be the top topic forever.
That would be great.
Hopefully we can fix it. We can move on. But what else should voters look for? Again, if I think of myself as I'm a pro-free enterprise voter, and I want to, quote unquote, vote for free enterprise.
Yeah.
What are the kinds of things that I should be aware of, and how can I sort of have a framework or a guidepost as I'm sort of navigating what folks are going to be saying over the next year?
Yeah. So can I start with what people should not pay attention to?
Yes. Give us the naughty list of economic principles.
Okay. So the first thing, you can turn on a business news channel any time of day, and you're going to hear people getting really upset about the latest economic news data release, whatever it is. There'll be some reason to be upset at so-and-so or another so-and-so about what's happening. I want to discourage voters from really engaging in that sort of news on the economy and really taking it as informing about anything about, the current administration or something that someone has done in the past. Economic data is noisy. And so, while the media will bring a lot of attention to day-to-day, month-to-month, even year-to-year fluctuations, we don't learn a lot from those until we've kind of sit back and look at the long run. So I would discourage voters from, reading too much into stories that are drawing a lot of attention to recent fluctuations in data. I think the other thing to look out for are brags, I'll call them, from, the administration or from, referencing previous periods of time about the accomplishment of job creation or anything else similar. So just to give an example, the current administration kind of got picked on recently because they were bragging about how many jobs that they've created. And yeah, on the surface, that sounds really great. And they had bragged that they had created more jobs than any other administration had over a 4-year period of time, which, wow, that sounds really epic. But you also have to remember that they started out with a gigantic cavern hole in the ground to fill because they were coming out of the COVID pandemic where we shed jobs in a way that we'd never seen before. And so these statistics, while technically correct, are often misleading in that they're not appropriately characterizing the situation, and seldom do they give you a lot of insight into how well a particular candidate or politician has supported free enterprise.
So it's kind of, number one, focus on the long view. Don't get hung up on the simple day-to-day. To quote Arthur Brooks, former president of AEI, now kind of a happiness scholar.
Yes.
But I've heard him say before in years past that politics is kind of like the weather and ideas are like climate.
Yes.
So I wonder if that analogy is helpful here, that sort of the day-to-day fluctuations in economic activity are a little bit more like weather. But the climate, which is free enterprise as a system, that's the climate.
Yes.
Is that a good way to distinguish?
I think that's a great way to think about it. Yep.
So those are sort of the things to send up red flags for our listeners. And hey, if somebody says this, be wary.
Yep.
What are some of the positive things? What's again a framework or a set of principles? What can guide a listener as they're looking at, okay, how do I sort fact from fiction with who is a candidate who really is standing up for free enterprise? What can guide their approach?
So I want to give kind of an abstract way of thinking about this. And, it's often something that economists lean back on in justifying different ideas. I like to say that somebody who is supporting free enterprise is someone who's thinking about policies that are increasing the pie. So economists like to call it the pie, the economy, right? How much wealth there is that exists. You think of all sorts of different economic policies, and it's impossible to go with a checklist of things, to the voting booth and vote. You kind of need a broader framework for think about it. I want to think about things that work towards increasing the economic pie that we have as a nation to divide up amongst us, rather than policies that are hyper-focused on how to divide that pie. Because very often those are policies that also work towards contracting the pie.
So is it fair to say that if somebody's economic agenda is solely focused on redistributing the wealth that already exists at the expense of let's grow the economic pie, as opposed to somebody who says, well, I want to focus first on let's grow everything. Another analogy that economists often use is a rising tide lifts all ships.
Yeah, that's right.
And so is it kind of that, okay, first and foremost, we need to grow the pie. We need to expand the amount of wealth that just exists for everyone. And then step two is, okay, yes, let's have some conversations about how to organize that, the sort of the blessing of modern free enterprise in a way that can benefit people. Is it a kind of a 1-2 punch?
Yeah, exactly. And I think taxes are really a good example of policy where this becomes kind of transparent. So the thing I worry about with higher taxes, whether they be on corporations or on wealthy individuals, I worry that it's going to shrink that pie. I mean, income is basically what drives us to create. Entrepreneurs create new businesses because there's the promise of wealth on the other side of it. It's usually not just because they're, ambitious and, driven to improve the world, right? So if we start to affect that reward through taxation, I worry that we lose some of that innovation, some of the business innovation that makes all of our lives better because of that. And so that's not to say that we shouldn't tax and redistribute funds to people. I mean, I think that's a necessary part of our political and economic system. But I do think that emphasis first for the candidates that I'd be looking at is going to be on expanding the pie, that is, limiting the disincentives to growth through taxation and instead focusing on making all boats rise.
So with that, what are some ways that you can do that? I mean, we have so many debates these days, it seems, about free markets, about various industries and how well they're doing and what government response should be.
Yeah.
But what's maybe a good application, a couple applications of what are some maybe subset policy areas of economic policy?
Yeah.
And how can we think about them through the lens of, okay, is this growing the pie or not?
Yeah, so I think globalization and trade policy is a good example of this. And I think it's one where even Republicans, who I think largely would identify as being supporters of markets, are sometimes divided. The notion of constraining global trade is actually in line with constraining the growth of the pie. Basic economic tells us that when we allow freer trade, we also allow more growth. Trade allows for specialization. It allows that people in the United States to do things that they're the best at, and people in other countries to do things that they're the best at, and then we trade, and it makes the pie bigger for everyone. So any sort of protectionist policies that put constraints on trade are going to work against that. And now, like I'm going to say in every specific policy area, there are trade-offs to that, and maybe completely free trade is not the appropriate policy for a number of reasons, but working towards that or having that as a priority that we measure those trade-offs against should be top line.
Again, there's this theme of balance coming out. There's kind of this, if the economy is a ship and we have to guide it thoughtfully in the right direction, you don't want to grab it and turn it suddenly and violently in one direction. It's sort of a steady, balanced guiding approach. Are there any other issues that come to mind that, again, folks could focus on and think through when they hear things said that we can apply this concept of growing the pie in a balanced way to?
Yeah. I think something that will likely come up in the next cycle is a conversation about minimum wage. So this is one where, a lot of folks are calling for us to increase the federal minimum wage to something like $15 an hour. There are a lot of people who are employed across the country at wages that are less than $15 an hour, and wouldn't it be great if they all made $15 an hour? In a way, yes. But in doing so, we are shrinking the pie in another way. And that's that, if we are to constrain businesses to pay at least $15 an hour, we're very likely to see a lot of businesses shut down to constrain the number of employees that they have. So in that sense, shrinking the pie, redistributing in the sense that the workers who benefit are the ones who win. But we've got a smaller pie that we can now share with everyone.
You mentioned workers. One of the big issues that's been on the radar here in Utah as well as elsewhere is workforce shortages. And the fact that it's, for many businesses, it's just really hard to fill jobs.
Yeah.
I'm assuming that'll come up again in this election cycle this next year. Any insights there of what we can be looking for?
Well, I think this is one that's actually going to be really related to the discussion about immigration policy. So again, this is one where there are a lot of factors to balance. But when you think about what is the policy that supports business, that supports economic growth, more open borders, allowing more people to come be part of our economy and to grow the economy to make it bigger is actually better for that. Now, again, we're balancing that against a lot of other factors, and each voter can make their own decision about what they think is the right policy. But in terms of what is the policy that supports free enterprise, it is going to be an more open border system.
And I think one of the things that often comes up in that issue specifically is a focus on, yes, we need robust and efficient legal immigration, but we also need a way to make sure that folks are doing it legally and it's in line with what is in line with the laws and also what is in line with our workforce needs.
Right.
So does that again come back to this question of balance of there are sort of extremes on both ends? What we have to be able to do is have a discussion about what's the right balance.
Yeah, exactly. And I think one extreme or the other is almost never the correct solution. So, I wouldn't be looking for someone who's out shouting for completely open borders without restriction, because even though I'm not an immigration scholar, I can bet that that's probably the wrong policy, just like a completely closed border system is going to be wrong too. And then we all have different values. And so the trade-offs that we think about as counting against the benefits of a more open border system that does support free enterprise, that trade-off is going to be different for everyone. So, voters who want to think of supporting free enterprise as a major tenet of what drives their vote will also have to balance it against the other things that are important to them.
The last question I want to ask you about the workforce piece specifically is there's also a lot of economic data showing pretty concerning numbers of working age population sitting on the sidelines, not engaging in work. Is that a better place to look first for kind of filling our workforce needs? Is the people who are here who are not working? Is there a reason to prioritize there?
Well, I think we should, all of the above, right? Which is that we want to get as many people working as want to work and can contribute to the economy in a positive way. So, we need to make sure we're continuing to invest in education to make sure that the skills of the workforce that we do have domestically are matching the needs of the companies that are trying to hire workers, and work to identify where the mismatch is. So, yeah, I think, again, all of the above.
So to round things out, basically there's a good, wise economic policy that would be pro-free enterprise is focused on making the pie bigger. It's a balanced approach. Of course, we want to weigh pros and cons and different factors when we get into specific issues.
Right.
To have, again, kind of this reasonable approach. Anything else you would add to frame for our listeners so they can go forth and be more informed consumers of political campaign season content in a way that can support free enterprise?
Well, look, the idea of being strictly about growing the pie is kind of a purist attitude that I don't expect any voter to have. But I do think that people want to incorporate the idea of supporting, defending free enterprise as part of their individual political ideology. So I think knowing that that's what you're chasing and then balancing that against the other things that are important to you is the way to go when it comes to thinking about which candidate is going to be the best match for your value system.
Well, Beth, we want to thank you for helping our listeners essentially elevate their economic knowledge and become more effective defenders of free enterprise. And it's so grateful for you coming on doing these segments with us and appreciate your time and expertise.
Of course, it's always fun to be here. Thank you.
Well, we have one more break before we leave you with some final talking points. This is Defending Ideas. We'll be right back.
Sometimes it's hard to keep up with the latest policy debate that affects your life. The solution? Subscribe to Sutherland Institute's weekly newsletter, where you'll find in-depth insights from seasoned policy experts, compelling multimedia, and advance notice of special events. Visit sutherlandinstitute.org.
Welcome back to Defending Ideas. Before you go, want to share a couple quick talking points. First, thanks again to Beth Akers for coming on as this regular segment called Defending Enterprise, where we want to help equip you with the ability to be better champions of our wonderful free enterprise system. As far as today's episode, there's really one key takeaway that we can use to equip ourselves as we evaluate the statements of candidates in this campaign season over the next year. And that's, first and foremost, to look for policy ideas that really do prioritize making the economic pie bigger. If we can grow the economy overall, that creates the space and the opportunities for a lot of the targeted economic programs that many of us care about and think can be beneficial. So focusing first on growing the economic pie, making it bigger, is a really core, important principle of a free enterprise system. We hope you have enjoyed this episode and that you feel better equipped to defend some of the ideas we talked about today. If you liked what you heard, please visit us at defendingideas.org. You can subscribe to this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google, essentially any of the major platforms, wherever you prefer to get your shows. You can also find short clips from this episode that you can use in your conversations with friends and family, and we hope you share that content on your social channels. Also, you can subscribe on YouTube if you prefer to watch entire episodes there. And lastly, if you want to support the work of Sutherland Institute, please visit sutherlandinstitute.org/donate. Thank you so much again for joining us on another episode of Defending Ideas. From the Sutherland Institute in Salt Lake City, I'm Nic Dunn. We'll see you next time.